I'm currently reading David Norbrooke's excellent Poetry and Politics in the English Renaissance, which explores the political use of poetry, the resonances of the political in the poetry of this era. And certain things he had to say about what he calls the prophetic poetry of the 16th century struck me as really interesting in terms of how some Christians use the Bible now. So what he meant by prophetic poetry is poetry that sought to critique the world order as it was, particularly against the Catholic Church. So for the Protestants of the time, they were opening up the book of Revelation, which in the medieval era had largely been marginalised or turned into a sort of spiritual, allegorical source book for personal ethics. But the Protestants often used it as a way to criticise the papacy. They picked up on the figure of Babylon, the great city, the whore Babylon, and applied this to the Roman Catholic Church, appropriately enough for them, as Babylon in its original context probably was referring to the city of Rome and the Roman Empire, detailing the wealth that it got, the slaves, the slavery it was built on, and the way it sought to dominate the world. So for the Protestants of this time, particularly it seems during the reign of Edward VI in England, it was quite natural then to reapply this imagery to the Roman Catholic Church. But what's interesting to me is that of late, it seems to me this strong anti-Catholic use of Revelation has largely disappeared, or at least become very muted among evangelical Protestants. They are, of course, no less keen sometimes of using biblical prophecy, seeking to discern how it applies to present day events, most notably to do with the state of Israel. But to my knowledge, or in my experience, there's not this attempt to make the Roman Catholic Church as the main enemy, the big sinister power threatening Protestant freedom. In fact, the opposite seems to have happened. Roman Catholicism is seen, at least in some ways, as a kind of ally in the kind of culture wars that evangelicals are most concerned with, notably to do with abortion or the LGBT movement. And even the Catholic Church is seen as a somewhat legitimate predecessor to Protestant civilization, whereas maybe in previous generations, not that long ago, evangelicals would have seen the medieval church as thoroughly corrupt and wicked and really largely a complete blackout in terms of the true faith, so to speak. Now they in some way want to see there being this one substance of Christianity, this essential core of Christianity that made the West good or moral or great, that persisted throughout Christianity's history since the time of Jesus, even through the medieval church and continuing on into the Protestant church. And that seems quite a new move to me, quite an unusual move historically. And I can't help but wonder if, in just the same way that clearly the Protestant reformers and poets were heavily influenced by the conflicts of the time and their own place within them, the shift in the global situation has resulted in this change in outlook. So it's no secret that the Cold War heavily shaped many evangelicals' interpretation of the Bible. of Russia. I think Russia was seen as being perhaps prophesied in Ezekiel, the figure of Magog and Gog, and the great enemy to be defeated. And maybe there was still an anti-Catholic flavour to this in the conflicts over Latin America, where Catholic liberation theology was taking the side of the poor and oppressed. There's very remarkable evidence to show that Nixon and the CIA used Protestant missionary organisations like Wycliffe Bible translators to push back against what they saw as a sort of semi-communist threat. And wherever Wycliffe translators went, they encouraged indigenous peoples to not resist the takeover of their land, to not resist the commodification of their societies. And perhaps I haven't read that much into the era, but I can imagine there could still be an anti-Catholic aspect to this, but fused with the fear of communism during that Cold War time. But of course, the Cold War is over, and even now, with Trump being more lenient to Putin, there's even been some US evangelicals who are now saying Russia is a Christian country and in some way on the right side, as it were. And I wonder how that's affected their use of apocalyptic prophecy. But I think that the key issue now is the kind of civilization that Christians, the evangelicals, see themselves as part of and see themselves as advancing. And to my mind, it's very clear that US imperialism, which involves the State of Israel and has for a long time, is very much bound up with capitalism, with industrialization. And we can see that in the genocide in Gaza, the use of AI systems to target civilians, to target whole families, the environmental destruction and pollution. Even, for example, Israel spraying herbicides on Syrian farms, on Lebanese farms, very much a deliberate attempt to destroy these societies. And this is important, of course, when it gets to the current invasion or attacks on Iran. For Pete Hegseth, one of Trump's main men, is an evangelical Christian who sees himself as playing a key role in bringing about Jesus' return by attacking Iran. There's reports of many commanders in the US Army who are also advancing this kind of narrative. And if you have been a beneficiary of Western civilization, then you may well be tied into some of this thinking. Here in the UK, it strikes me that Christian Zionism is more of a lower middle class pursuit of the boomer generation who did quite well for themselves. They climbed up the social ladder. But as Adorno, I think, observed, the lower middle class are likely to be more aggressive, more vocally aggressive, precisely because their position in society is somewhat more tenuous. They don't want to slip back to where they were. And in some way, maybe their use of scripture to endorse the State of Israel is a kind of allegory for their own struggle, their own plucky attempt to better themselves, their own sense of being potentially surrounded by enemies who could take that away. And of course, they are very much tied into a general anti-immigration, anti-Islam ideology as part of this. Whereas in the UK, evangelicals who have perhaps been more solidly middle class, they are not likely to be Zionists. It's in some ways not much of an issue for them, one they're sort of willing to sideline. They would more focus on the gospel, say, well, we just need to preach the gospel. But, of course, their own position it continues to benefit from the world order. Their pension funds continue to accrue returns, probably from Israeli companies or indirectly even. And it's that kind of both sidesism, as people would say, that plays its own role within this bigger picture. And certainly the upper middle class, who tend to be the demographic that conservative evangelical Anglicanism is formed of, are not going to be invested in certain Zionist interpretations of Scripture. They will likely hold to the Reformed narrative held by Calvin, that the prophecies about Israel refer to the church, and so on. And it's notable that one of the few anti-Zionist voices comes from the conservative Anglican sphere, the Reverend Stephen Sizer. So there's a lot more, obviously, that could be unpacked and said about all this. But it's clear to me that when people see biblical prophecies as being clearly about the Roman Catholic Church, or clearly about the state known as Israel from 48, it must be questioned. These things have not been clear for many Christians throughout history, and it must be asked if the use of this highly malleable, reusable imagery is much more than a vehicle for one's own hopes and wishes, one's own attempts to defend one's place in the global order, an order that's looking increasingly shaky, at least for the West, and may develop in quite astonishing ways that the boomer generation, at least, couldn't have foreseen.